Hi, my name is Shania, and I decided to do my final project on ethics in psychological research. The job of a psychologist is to investigate and observe the mind and behavior, and in order for them to do this, they need to perform experiments using the scientific method, which is a set of guidelines that researchers follow to come up with theories, test them, and find conclusions. And the ultimate purpose of performing these experiments is to inspect behaviors and explain why they took place. I chose this topic because I wanted to tie in my final project to my degree of social services, and I believe it's important to analyze the flaws and atrocities of past experiments to prevent similar experiences from happening again. And as I was researching, I came across a lot of experiments that treated people horribly, and I felt a personal obligation to bring this information to light. Modern-day psychological experiments are enforced by laws and regulations that protect everyone involved, but psychologists didn't always have a set of rules they needed to abide by in order to perform them, and the conditions of these studies just a few decades ago were far from ethical, and in some cases they were dangerous too. And without a set of regulations to follow, it's easy for the participants to be manipulated and treated unfairly. The first experiment I looked at is the Stanford prison experiment, and in this experiment, in August 1971, Dr. Philip Zimbardo conducted an experiment at Stanford University to study the effects of labels that are perpetuated by societal norms and social expectations. And these participants portrayed the roles of prisoners and prison guards, and they became so absorbed in their roles that the officers tortured the prisoners, and the prisoners became hostile in retaliation. And over the course of 6 days, utter chaos ensued, and this happened until Zimbardo had to end it because it became too much. The next experiment I looked at is the monster study, and in this study, psychologists at the University of Iowa, Wendell Johnson, and graduate student Mary Tudor led an experiment to unravel the mystery of stuttering in 1939. And this experiment was conducted on 22 orphans, and these 22 children were divided into 2 groups with and without speech problems. And one group was given positive reinforcement about their speech, while the other was ridiculed for their speech. And those who were verbally abused made no progress, and some orphans who didn't even have speech problems developed them. And this study lasted for 6 months and caused some of the children to develop long-lasting, chronic psychological problems. The next case I looked at was the Aversion Project, and during the South African apartheid, South African military doctors, led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, created an experiment in an effort to cure homosexuality, and those who conducted the experiment viewed gay soldiers as conscripts who used drugs, and as a result, these soldiers were forced to undergo horrible procedures such as electroshock therapy, chemical castration, and even sex change operations. Most of these 900 victims were 16 to 24-year-old male conscripts, but some of them were lesbian soldiers. And surprisingly, Dr. Levin was relocated to Canada until he was arrested for the assault of a patient. The final study I looked at is the Tuskegee Syphilis study, in which the U.S. Public Health Service and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention conducted a study in Tuskegee, Alabama, to examine the history of syphilis. And the purpose of this experiment was to observe the effects of syphilis when untreated. This study was highly problematic, though, and it was performed on 600 black men, 399 of which had syphilis and 201 men who didn't have it. And the researchers told the participants that they were being treated for bad blood, which meant having a sickness around that area, and they weren't informed of the entire nature of the experiment. And as an exchange for participating, the men were given free medical examinations, meals, and burial insurance. However, out of the 399 men, 28 of them died with syphilis, 100 of them died of complications, 40 of their wives became infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. The moral responsibility psychologists have is crucial in making sure that the participants of studies are not harmed, and the participants of these studies have rights that psychologists and researchers have to follow and have to respect. To prevent atrocities like this from happening again, the American Psychological Association created a code of ethics for psychologists and researchers to abide by, and this code essentially prioritizes the safety and well-being of all persons involved in an experiment and to protect the reputation of psychology as a whole. This code was initially established in 1953, but it's constantly changing and growing, and some of the values that are looked after in this code are competence, human relations, and confidentiality. One aspect of this topic that is very important is informed consent, in which investigators should always try to obtain the consent of participants, and the participants have to know what they're consenting to. So in order to provide informed consent to these participants, they have to be provided with an information sheet listing the details of the study and contact information of those conducting the experiment. And the details can include a statement saying that participation is voluntary, the purpose of the study, potential risks, the procedures, benefits of the research, and the right to confidentiality. Now, the future of psychological studies is really endless. There's no telling what it is that future psychologists want to study, but if one thing's for sure, it is their legal and moral obligation to protect those who are involved. And the safety of those involved is really dependent on researchers respecting the rights of those involved. And it really comes down to understanding that the well-being of others is far more important than an experiment. And here are my references.